Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We've got a really great presentation that Dan has put together. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer of Spigit, and it's my pleasure to introduce Dan Beeler today. Dan's a member of Forrester's Business Technology Futures team, and that deals with CIOs and their business partners. And he evaluates and guides the CIO and strategy teams to manage the diverse demands on the business technology agenda. And in particular, he defines strategies that help businesses benefit from digital transformation and drive business innovation. So he is the right expert today from Forrester to discuss business innovation and digital transformation today. So by way of background, just a little bit about Spigit. So at Spigit, what we do is we help our customers harness the collective intelligence of their employees, customers, and partners to solve today's problems, maximize tomorrow's opportunities, and accelerate innovation. We're the largest player in ideation management, and we're super proud to play in this space and to work with some of the best companies in the world. And they include companies in financial services like AIG and American Express, and healthcare like United Health Group and Pfizer, and in manufacturing like BMW and Siemens, and some of the world's largest system integrators as well also use Spigit. We've got some experience in ideation management. Over the last 10 years, over 100,000 winning ideas have been implemented by our customers. And often many of these ideas are about digital transformation, which is why we wanted to invite Dan to speak today. Spigit's a complete ideation management solution, and it is scalable to your enterprise. It's built to lead and last, and one of the primary use cases of Spigit today is to help innovation teams figure out how to help their companies with digital transformation. So with that, I want to hand it over to Dan. For the bulk of the presentation today is going to be about Dan's presentation. At the end, as Jeremy said, we'll be taking questions, so feel free to put questions in the chat box, and we'll make sure to ask Dan them at the end.
Great. Well, thank you very much for the kind introduction. I'm Dan Beeler, and I will take you through the presentation today that we prepared. And I will share with you what we see out there in terms of digital transformation and also the role that innovation plays as part of this process. At Forrester, we work with all sorts of business and technology leaders, and we really try to help them to develop a strategy that is fully focusing on the customers in order to drive top-line growth. The issues that I would like to discuss with you today are pretty straightforward. Firstly, we look at customer expectations and how they are transforming from the broken experiences that we often have towards much more frictionless experiences. I will then look at innovation as one of the key drivers for the operational excellence and customer management improvements and engagement improvements that we see out there, before looking at the platform issue that is really gaining momentum, platforms as the foundation for new value creation, and then I will summarize with a couple of high-level recommendations what you should think about when designing your digital transformation strategy. Now let's start off with the issue of how your customers will change their expectations towards the much more frictionless experiences that are out there. If we look at the nature of engagement that most businesses have with their customers, it's very helpful to use the customer lifecycle and the various stages that occur during the customer journey. And we believe that you need to put the customer at the center of your digital transformation strategy, because the various technological shifts that are occurring have big ramifications for how you need to serve and cater to the different needs and desires and wants that your customer has across the different life cycle stages. And things are, of course, a lot more complicated and complex than the simple customer life cycle would suggest. Not only are you dealing with different stages from discover, explore, buy, use, ask, and engage, but of course you have different channels that you need to address, and you need to really target the different roles, the types of customers that you're dealing with. And accordingly, that you also need to align the investments, the digital investments that you're conducting, to match the different challenges and requirements and shifting demand patterns across these different stages in the life cycle. What we see is that the same is happening also from the angle of a business as a vendor perspective, and we see that the different stages in the value chain are really impacted by digital transformation. So we have, of course, the supply chain, we have product development, we have then marketing, sales, and after sales. The whole thing is embedded in a broader set of collaboration activities and innovation activities. And what we see is that whilst digital transformation is focusing primarily on very specific customer focused outcomes, the processes involved in digital transformation actually impact all these different stages in the value chain. And this is a fairly important part to recognize, because if we then look back at the customer life cycle, we see that things become fairly complex quickly. So if we take the customer life cycle and map it against the value chain, we see that the impact on customer experience is quite significant depending on which stage in the value chain we are looking at. So if we look at the supply chain, we are talking about digital transformation efforts that need to help you to deliver products and services faster. For instance, you could deploy communication platforms. You need to react more quickly to the changing customer expectations. So think of, say, fashion requirements that change depending on particular market trends much more quickly than in the past, or maybe unseasonal weather. You need to offer better product availability and, for instance, help predict changes in the supply chain from a logistics perspective. You need to be concerned around issues to achieve more accurate order delivery, for instance, the picking efficiency in warehouses. And of course, also the financial stability is quite important, and there we see that transparent logistics really help to optimize inventory management, just to give you one example. If we look at product development, completely different issues pop up here. For instance, you need to customize products to customer outcomes much more so. So design thinking is an important part of your digital transformation strategy. You need to think about improving the operational efficiencies. For instance, the use of digital twins or digital threads, and we talk about them in a while. You need to think about speeding up the product design. Minimal and viable product design thinking pops up as an important theme. And of course, there are issues like speeding up the innovation cycles. So ongoing over-the-air software updates, for instance, are increasingly common for products. And of course, lowering the product costs themselves is quite important. For instance, in manufacturing, rapid prototyping is increasingly common. Marketing is impacted. We see that it's important to deliver fast and easy access to product information. That's where, for instance, vloggers and bloggers come in. Relevant information for the individual customer is quite important. And so aspects as for instance, delivering particular service in the orchestration suite becomes important. And the sales are, of course, impacted. Delivering omni-channel capabilities, removing unnecessary touch points. Think of Amazon Go. Blending the online and offline customer experiences. Rebecca Minkoff has some very interesting stores available where they are trying to combine these two worlds. And of course, facilitating predictive commerce is increasingly talked about. Look at what Shop at Home is doing together with Salesforce's Einstein platform. And don't forget that the after-sales process That's where we see that increasingly it's important to provide some context-based and personalized support. For instance, providing customers the ability to get advice based on, for instance, camera shots that they can take with their own smartphones. Delivering also real-time status updates on reports and maintenance jobs. And of course, providing self-help options. They are increasingly required by customers. So you see that digital transformation becomes quite quickly complex because the different stages during the life cycle need to be also mapped across the value chain stages. And of course, ultimately, it's very much about driving business outcomes. And there's a vast spectrum out there that we can see. For instance, we see that GE, when they're talking about their wind farms, is generating quite significant optimization insights based on machine learning, where they look at wind patterns overlaid with the performance of their own wind farms, and the position of the rotor plates can be adjusted so that more energy can be generated relatively quickly. If we look at Airbus, for instance, they are looking at de-icing that is simulated in a virtual environment by the use of digital twins. And this is speeding up the development of particular design patterns, as for instance, in the case here, the de-icing components for aircraft wings. And we see the use of blockchain popping up. And a good example here would be Walmart. They're using blockchain to track food throughout the entire value chain. And because blockchain enables you to have irrefutable records, it really helps you to trace the food and the guarantee that you can deliver to your customers in terms of the food quality completely differently to the past. And in Spain, we see that Siemens is selling high-speed trains with a guarantee of arrival time. It's a very high SLA that these trains arrive on time. How do they do it? They have tons of sensors in the tracks, in the trains, and there is a high degree of preemptive maintenance. So they replace parts before they break so that the arrival times of the trains can be guaranteed. Of course, many companies can't do this on their own. They need to think about working as part of ecosystems together with partners, but also with customers. And we see that the traditional tech vendor partner landscape is really quite widespread, and many ecosystems that are evolving are comprising technology vendors from very different backgrounds, hardware, software, systems integration, but even traditional manufacturing firms are moving into this space because everybody, of course, is increasingly aware of the fact that software is becoming a critical part of product and service development, and that, of course, also includes AI. What we see is the emergence of many, many different ecosystems. And just to give you one example here, this is the example of an ecosystem that received a award fairly recently. It's the Testbed Showcase winner, and the award came from the Industrial Internet Consortium in the States. The range of different partners here gives you an indication how complex some of these ecosystems become. And the ultimate goal, of course, is to ensure a much better interoperability, end-to-end processes, support design for ensuring a much more frictionless experience, as we talked about earlier, and to optimize the operational efficiencies involved in increasingly complex manufacturing processes. Now let's move on to the next part and look at innovation and the role innovation plays as a key driver for operational excellence and the customer engagement. And we feel that innovation and digital transformation are really very closely intertwined and related. because there are, of course, different layers involved here. From a technology layer, it's clear that you need to drive the innovation around emerging new technologies, and we will look at them in a second. But it's also the constantly changing and evolving customer desires that you need to think about and address through ongoing innovation. And last but not least, there are big shifts to the operational setup that businesses need to change. So restructuring will also require a lot of innovation. So let's look at some of the key digital technologies that we believe are absolutely crucial and will be really supported through creative and ongoing innovation. They include, of course, 3D printing. Local Motors is a US-based company. It's a manufacturing firm, if you like, and a software firm at the same time. They're using 3D printing to print cars. They print the car chassis, and they do this in a couple of hours. The customer benefit here is that you are obtaining really mass customized cars very quickly. And this is just the beginning. They're really restructuring the value chain that we are used to. So big innovation going into this space of 3D printing. We see that in AI and machine learning, a lot of innovation is happening. The case of Visa is interesting because Visa has teamed up with IBM to work on predictive commerce. So as our devices, assets become more and more connected, they will have more and more sensors. And based on machine learning, they track your behavior as a customer. And for instance, your sneakers, your running shoes could tell you when they wear out to a point where you should really think about buying new shoes. But rather than telling you that you should buy the shoes, there could be automatic triggers in the design of the shoe based on a payment system that the shoes get ordered automatically. Of course, you as a customer, you have to opt into this kind of scheme, but it gives you an idea of what is happening based on machine learning type of innovation. If we look at connectivity as a subject area, Maersk is playing around with very interesting solutions where they connect all their containers and, of course, their big container boats. This allows customers to see exactly where their products are, relatively speaking, to their supply chain, and it makes it much easier for them to have just-in-time deliveries. EasyJet, the UK-based airline, is using virtual reality and, in particular, augmented reality to give their pilots and support staff on the ground in airports where they don't have their own engineering teams, smart glasses. So either the pilot or some other support staff can go around the planes and check particular issues that might require the attention of special personnel. And rather than having to wait for an engineer to fly in to look at a particular tricky aspect of a plane, they can use these smart glasses to check with a control center in Luton in the UK whether a particular faulty part on the plane is safe to fly or whether the plane needs to be grounded. The benefit for the customer, of course, is that there is much less travel disruption, and for EasyJet the benefits are obvious. You can keep the planes in the air much more than in the past. Chatbots are a big topic that is emerging, and the notion here is, of course, that you can solve the challenges, the inquiries that customers have much more quickly and in a much more simple and straightforward manner than through the classic contact center environments. And of course, we already mentioned blockchain, still early technology, early stages technology, but it will be very big in our view in the years to come. The Walmart example of mango tracking from the tree to the customer shelf is a good one to show you that the outcome, the business outcome for the customer would be a much safer food supply chain. And this is clearly a good indication of what can be done with technology through innovative use of these technologies. But there are also non-digital technologies, if you like, that are very important for the innovation process. If we think about nano computing and nanotechnology and quantum computing, we see that in manufacturing, for instance, new materials are created, nanotubes and nanoparticles can be used to have very light and very strong materials in the manufacturing process with completely different insulating properties. We see the production of solar panels will become much more efficient. In quantum computing, we see that the increased computing power will be providing industry and also the consumer space with much more potential for AI and machine learning. In the gene technology space, we see that you could, for instance, test for potential illnesses much more easily. In biotech, we see a lot happening around agriculture and farming, where you can increase the yield productivity quite significantly and lower also the input of fertilizers and similar cost inputs. Robotics matter significantly around the issues of reducing the risks to human beings. Think of a construction site where robots are involved in the construction of particularly dangerous areas, but also, of course, in the space of blue light services or the military. Robots are increasingly used to neutralize dangers. And of course, the energy debate in general will be significantly changed by the emergence of renewables. If you look at the cost statistics for solar, they are really coming down very, very significantly, and this will change how the industry overall will think about the use of energy intensive technologies. Of course, there are ultimately, there's always the goal to improve the customer outcomes, and therefore innovation needs to think around improving the customer expectations, as we discussed. In particular, we think that it's important to target hidden aspirations and unvoiced problems. And I want to share briefly 4 examples of what this could mean. Unilever, for instance, has developed a completely different way how they target emerging markets with dishwashing solutions. They are looking at customers in their environments in countries like Kenya or Tanzania and similar countries, and look at how they're actually preparing food, because the usage of dishwashing will be very different, and the requirements for the dishwashing liquid will be very different to the developed markets, of course. They're using innovation management tools to come up with ways to support the development of these new dishwashing liquids. And this is a very good example of what we call frugal innovation. We also see that certain firms are increasingly simplifying some of their products so that less qualified personnel can use them. A good example here would be certain Chinese companies like Newsoft, but also Siemens is doing this actually in emerging markets like China, to have CT scanners that are able to be operated by relatively unqualified nurses in rural hospitals. And the interesting part here is that, of course, you're helping, therefore, more patients to be treated with fairly sophisticated equipment. And this is not only applicable these days to these emerging markets. Siemens has seen that the demand for these types of devices is actually growing also in developed markets, and is now selling this equipment in the US, for instance. Spotify is an example for what you should do as a business. Ultimately, if you're going through your digital transformation, you can focus a lot on improving functions and features and trying to also maybe stem the tide of change. But the example of the shift from normal vinyl to CDs to then streaming ultimately is not changing the underlying customer demand for listening to music or getting some form of entertainment. It's just the medium that is changing. And the record industry has for years not understood this properly and has allowed the likes of Spotify to take a very large chunk of the market. Only now they're beginning to move into this. And similar examples could be provided in many other industries, whether it's the newspaper industry and other industries. But think about what is the ultimate customer aspiration, their unvoiced problems that you are trying to address. Don't focus on the products primarily. And Tata has developed a very small and cheap car for the Indian market. The point here is that they used, again, innovation management tools to think about the core aspects that a small car needs to have in order to address the customer aspirations for a middle class, the middle class that wants to have a car for the first time. And they have really cut down the elements that are required to come up with a car that is maybe not the nicest one, but it does the job and fulfills these aspirations of the emerging middle class in India. Now, where do the innovation management tools fall in terms of helping to stimulate cross-silo collaboration between the different stages in the value chain? Well, we believe that there is a continuum of different components here. If on the one hand, there are the traditional collaboration tools supporting team communication, like, for instance, Google for Work, and on the other extreme, you maybe have the innovation consulting firms, Deloitte, for instance. There is space for the tools that focus on idea generation, ideation management, potentially even the testing of ideas. And on the side closer to the collaboration tools, we find crowd collaboration tools like Jive. But the real juicy bit that we see is the space around idea generation and idea selection and idea testing, where we see the innovation management tools and solutions located, and that's where we see Spigit. So these, of course, need to deliver business benefits. That's ultimately the investment decision that drives the decision to buy and implement these tools. And a good example for tangible business benefits that can be obtained as a result of more open innovation is Procter & Gamble. They have been doing this for quite some time now. The project, the initiative is called P&G Connect and Develop. And I listed just a handful of benefits that their approach to open innovation has brought to them. And most notably, there are, of course, business outcomes that are more obvious here, but also the open innovation initiative is clearly, of course, focusing also on the customer's moments of need. And to highlight some of the examples here, you see that the percentage of the outside innovation, of total innovation, has increased from 15% to over 70%. So that is a huge jump. And we see also that in turn, the spend on traditional innovation infrastructures and R&D has gone down somewhat. This is not to say that open innovation is replacing traditional R&D. On the contrary, it's complementing it. No one would say that it's replacing it, but you see that overall there are cost-saving potentials as part of moving to open innovation. We see that there is a change in innovation metrics. They're much more outcome-focused. We see that in really extensive research networks are emerging, and there are some which are much more proprietary, others are much more open, and the number of partners for P&G has increased quite significantly. And if you look at the list of partners here, just some examples, you see it's a broad spectrum that are listed here, the real ecosystems are emerging around the open innovation activities here. And we see that patents in use in the P&G products have increased very significantly. Again, this is a clear business benefit in the sense of it helps P&G to differentiate their products against competitors that are pushing in and trying to commoditize the entire product range. And last but not least here, we see that the success rate of pushing new products through has really jumped quite significantly from 15% to over 50%. And this, of course, has an impact on the margins that P&G can generate. Now, I would like to briefly touch on platforms and the benefits of platforms that we see. And we believe that ultimately business platforms are really a very interesting part of the digital transformation momentum that we see. We define platforms as a modular technology base that is built around business APIs and that is designed for rapid configuration of the business models that are emerging, the business processes that are changing, and also the ecosystems that are popping up. And as you can see here, there are different ecosystem types that can be supported through the business platforms. There are the adjacent ecosystems, there are the internal ecosystems, the partner ecosystems, and also the direct customer ecosystems. The point here is that platforms facilitate the collaboration, the exchange of information across the platforms in real time at literally no cost and in omnidirectional fashion. And as we discussed earlier, collaboration is fundamental to boosting innovation and therefore also the digital transformation process. And we see that the platforms really help to generate and drive network effects. If you think about bringing in outside ideas through open innovation, you tend to attract some creative minds that are not working for you yet. These creative minds might help you to create a new value and in turn attract more interesting support in the form of users of the platform. We see that the platforms help you to scale up much more quickly and easily and cheaply because they're designed through their architecture setup to support the exponential growth, and they are running basically at a marginal cost base that is close to zero in terms of ramping up scale. We see that they are helping to build communities. If you think of, for instance, voting on particular innovation topics, platforms are very susceptible to this type of setup. We see that they provide tools for third parties to develop products and services. So APIs, app developers are a very important part of the debate here. And they drive innovation via crowdsourcing, reaching out to outside ideas and innovators, bring in third-party innovation, even if it's small aspects that third-party innovation can contribute. In sum, this very often can add up quite quickly to much larger amounts than what you might have been able to generate with your own traditional setup. And platforms, they transform, of course, also business models and how companies go to market once they go through the digital transformation process. On the left-hand side here, you see that the most common form of usage of platforms revolves around improving the operation process efficiency. So it's a clear cost focus. Very often this is an internal focus. It's margin improvement that is the name of the game here. And pretty much most businesses are looking into this here. The next step is, of course, to move beyond this and to start selling service availability instead of an asset. Think of the availability of an aircraft engine. Rolls-Royce and GE, they have been doing this for many years. More and more companies are moving down this path. And here the focus is much more external. and it boosts the delivery speed of particular services, and of course has the on-demand component to it. The ultimate step that we see as part of business model transformation is that you sell output on demand instead of the availability of a particular asset. Examples here would include a Siemens that is selling compressed air as opposed to selling the availability of the machine that produces this compressed air. This is a relatively new space. Very few companies are ready to move down this path already, but we believe that this will happen as part of the digital transformation process in the years to come. And the point here is that the platforms help you to shift to much more transformational selling. The examples of GE's Predix or Siemens MindSphere are a good example, where it's the selling focus is not so much on additional features and functions, but on productivity improvements. And we also see that they're helping ecosystem members to adjust the operation processes. So it's a focus on much more flexibility provisioning. The time to market needs to be shortened. The customer satisfaction needs to be improved. And of course, the metrics need to be adjusted accordingly. We see that the sale of service availability and eventually output are popping up increasingly, talked about, as I just mentioned. And another shift that we see is that the platform design, the scalability potential, the low-cost margins that are involved here to ramp up participation for innovative projects is actually driving the debate around exponential technology availability. You can start to innovate in completely different manners than in the past because it's much cheaper to come up with ideas. The challenge, of course, based on this type of environment would be that you could end up with a scattered knowledge base across many different parts of your organization or your ecosystem participants, and you need to learn how to manage this much greater wealth of innovation and innovative ideas. Now, with this, I would like to move on to the last part of my presentation and leave you with a couple of high-level recommendations. Firstly, digital transformation is not a technology implementation initiative. You should not focus on technology rollout. Do not start with the technology, but come from the customer's perspective. Remember the customer life cycle. Help the customer to go through the various stages and try to work through the changing customer expectations. Before you start, you really need to conduct a digital inventory. And by this, I mean, look at the degree of digitization that you have in your existing processes, the portfolio elements, the go-to-market activities. Try to get a feel for where you are today, because only then you can start to move into the areas that need support and improvement. Thirdly, the support from linear models to circular models of innovation are happening. Set up your digital transformation strategy in a way that supports the shift. And also remember that increasingly we see that customers are no longer happy to have products pushed at them. They're pulling them down to themselves. So the digital transformation initiative needs to reflect this different customer behavior. Customers take matters increasingly into their own hands. And design the operational workflow around the customer processes. Don't expect the customer to adjust their operational setup to your operations. It needs to be the other way around. And this applies to consumers and of business customers alike. And of course, very critical, it's sort of the liquidity that is the lubricants that is keeping the whole thing turning over. Provide collaboration and innovation tools for the various stakeholders in your ecosystems. They are critical in order to drive digital transformation. Digital transformation is not a project that will be completed in year 3 or 4. This will be an ongoing process, and there will not be the perfect time when you can say, we have made it, we achieved it, and now we can go back to doing things as in the past. Innovation and collaboration have to remain part of the ongoing way how you do business and deliver to customers. With this, I would like to thank you and open up the floor to discussion. Of course, you can also always contact me directly. You have the contact details here, but I'm very happy to take your questions now.
Everybody should feel free, as some have, to enter your questions into the question box. In the meantime, I'll grab a question that came in a little bit earlier. Does digital transformation require culture change? And if so, what is the role of the innovation team in helping change the culture?
Yeah, I would say that's the most important part of tackling digital transformation. As I said, it's certainly not a technology rollout. Digital transformation requires cultural change, primarily because I believe ultimately the firm of the future will have to rely on employees that are much more creative, that have some initiative, and where the passion for business is much higher than what we see today in most organizations. If you look at the levels of satisfaction at work, they are in really dangerously low territory. And the companies of the future, they need to be really customer focused. They need to delight their customers. If you are not happy at work, if you don't bring initiative, if you're not creative enough, it will be very tough to really translate into a customer obsessed business. And of course, what is behind this shift of becoming more creative, showing more initiative and passion at work, it lies management culture. And this is it's absolutely critical to cultural transformation. Without management culture changes, I think it will be extremely tough to succeed in the digital transformation process. And whenever we talk to CIOs of companies that are actually changing, organizations that are really making progress, they say the cultural element is the most important and challenging one.
Okay, we just got a really interesting question. Do you have examples of companies which have attempted to do digital transformation and failed in the process? What did they do wrong?
We have plenty of companies that failed in the process to date, maybe I should add. The most common mistake that we see is that they believe digital transformation is, as I mentioned earlier, something like a technology project. It's a bolt-on project, as we would call it. You create the digital division, you appoint a chief digital officer, and they think, job done. And it's similar to, like in the past, creating a e-commerce division. But digital transformation, as I tried to explain, affects every aspect of your business. The processes, the business models, the culture, as we just discussed, and of course the technology. But to think that you can have a bolt-on digital strategy and then you can tick the box and say, yes, we made it, this is the most common mistake that we see out there as the reason for failing in the digital transformation process. You need to think more holistically. And
are you seeing geographic differences in the pace of or adoption of digital transformation? There was a study came out last week. IDC said that Asia Pacific is lagging. Do you see that? Are they accurate?
Asia Pacific is a huge region, and it would be unfair to throw all of them in the same pot.
Fair enough.
there are big differences in corporate cultures, let's say, and North America tends to be more open to change. Also, certain countries in Europe, like the Netherlands, the UK, Sweden, and interestingly enough, in the B2B space, the business-to-business space, Germany seems to be quite open to change because they realize how dangerous the situation has become. So I think we see a lot of increased willingness to consider significant changes to how business is being done, including the business models in North America and in certain areas of Northern and Central Europe. I have seen some interesting examples also in Asia Pacific, but nowhere near in percentage terms as in North America or Northern and Central Europe. And it goes back to the company cultures, the hierarchies that are at work, the unwillingness to try out new things and maybe fail a little bit in the process, readjust. This is all part of the digital transformation debate, and therefore I think in Asia Pacific there is a real need to rethink business culture overall. And the challenge, of course, is that a lot of the people that went through the traditional business schools and who are in power now, they carry with them knowledge that is a few decades old. And it's no small task to change this environment over the next 5 years.
Interesting question. What are your top 3 industries that you see most ripe for digital disruption?
Well, a lot of them, or several, have already gone through most of the disruption. We mentioned the music industry, publishing has really had their fair share, media in general. I would say that banking is really ripe for it, manufacturing is ripe, healthcare. These are the industries where we see significant movement, and of course retail is right in the process of adjusting to it. But banking, healthcare, manufacturing, this is where we see the biggest momentum. But I would say that retail has been going for some time already, and there's a lot of momentum happening there. And some of the industries we almost consider they've gone through it.
In a pull economy where the ability to predict and control becomes more and more challenging, what elements of leadership would you first tackle before moving into the digital transformation?
Well, I mentioned management innovation earlier on. You need to create an environment where people are ultimately ready to be more creative, show more initiative, and also bring back some passion for what they're doing. These are not aspects that only a handful of workers have within a firm or so. Everybody has the potential to bring these assets. It requires a shift in management style, in my view, to allow your employees to work differently, to bring themselves into the innovation debate that we discussed earlier on, to lower the silos between different divisions, but also lower the hierarchies that have been built up over the last few decades in business, and to collaborate much more, to brainstorm much more. And I see that there's a lot happening in this space, but old habits are difficult to break in many respects. But I believe the companies that are most ready to accept that things are really changing will be the ones that manage to go through this digital transformation process. And we should be not naive about the percentage of companies that will go through the overall digital transformation process. There are many different guesstimates out there, but they range between 40 to 60% of companies that might not make it over the next 10 years. There are shocking statistics, how many people, or companies I should say, will be in the Fortune 500 in 10 years' time of the names that we see today. You just have to look at the brand value that is released every year For the top 20, 30 businesses around the world, the biggest companies, there has been a dramatic shift over the last 10 years.
Wow. So on the prior slide, you mentioned that companies need to move from a linear model to a circular model of innovation. Can you describe that a little bit more?
Yeah. The gist is quite simple here. The idea is that in the past, you had your traditional R&D teams. They worked on a new project, a new product, added additional functions and features. It went through the testing phase. Then some marketing message was created. Sales had to sell it, and then it was pushed out to the customer. What we see happening in a digital context is that the innovation cycle becomes much more circular, software style, if you like. So you start developing a beta model of a product or a service. You launch it with maybe a limited audience, a test audience, as a pilot, and you collect feedback immediately. You improve it on the fly, the product or the service. If the feedback is terrible, then you shelve the whole idea, the whole project. But then you re-release it again as the next version, version 2, version 3, and this process continues. And we see that this will gradually turn into the normal mode of product development, of innovation in general, because the old idea that you will have the perfect product at one day, and then you sell it to the customers and they're happy with this product forever and ever. This is not the reality of today anymore. Look at Tesla, for instance. They released their car with a particular software version, but Tesla is updating the software, the operating system of the car, if you like, overnight. And you come back in the morning to your car and it has new features. It was sent over the air onto your car, uploaded, and so the product itself is changing. The whole self-driving functionality of Tesla was updated over the air. And we see this is happening right across the board. The more connected devices you have, the more software reliant they become, the more we move away from the idea that the product is perfect and finished forever. There will be no product that is absolutely finished. There will always be some form of update available as long as the product can be connected. And of course, the customer feedback plays a fundamental role in this process. Customer feedback, if you think back to the customer life cycle, once you bought the product, once you start using it, you of course start to share your experiences with the product, either with the vendor, but also with your friends and family and so on. And there need to be the feedback loop directly back to the innovation teams, to the R&D teams, to the product development teams, so that they can improve the product on an ongoing basis.
Really appreciate the time, and thank you everybody for joining the Spigit webinar series.